Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 152 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and over 350 partnering organizations that have come together during this extraordinary pandemic to create an open space every day so that people from all around the world can come together and share their experiences, their solutions, their hopes, their fears, their visions, their strategies, so that we can work together more effectively to ensure that the post-pandemic world is truly a better world, more abundant, more resilient, more healthy, and more in alignment with natural systems. This has been a very exciting day for many of us. Just before coming on this call, we were on a big call of Humanity Rising participants as we've been fashioning a completely new kind of MBA. You know, the MBA is the most sought after degree in the world, the Masters of Business Administration. And we've been discussing the launch next spring of a Master's in Regenerative Action. This came out of the sessions on Humanity Rising that were convened by Ed Muller. You'll remember in July, the president of the University of International Cooperation in Costa Rica. He brought in Kate Rayworth, whose book, Donut Economics, has really taken the world of economics by storm, and cities starting with Amsterdam have embraced donut economics and putting human well-being in the center and ecological systems and constraints on the periphery, followed by dozens of cities around the world. John Fullerton with his regenerative economics and regenerative finance. It's clear that we're no longer in a world where we can be sustainable with anything, because the ecology of the earth is no longer stable. We have so systematically destroyed the environment that sustainability is no longer relevant, and neither is adaptation. The only option left for the human race at this moment, when scientists tell us that we're literally running out of time, is to regenerate. How can we humans come together in the spirit of regenerative action, linking with bioregion development around the world, linking with cities around the world, linking with corporations, and really bring into global parlance regenerativity as the watchword of the hour. So it's been very, very exciting for many of us in Humanity Rising to be part of this ebullient initiative to create a master's in regenerative action, to empower people on the ground with the skill sets and the tool sets that they need to actually make a critical difference at this very critical time. So it's been a very empowering day for me and others. And we want to now turn to a slightly different domain, which is the subject for today, but equally important. This is the first time since we launched Humanity Rising on May 22nd that we're turning explicitly to the question of the great religions, the axial religions, all ancient, all contributive to civilization as we know it, all normative for millions billions of people. You think of Buddhism and Christianity, Islam. These are major world religions that have the allegiance of billions of people across the world. Religions like Judaism that are more ethnically based, but powerful in their lineage and in their contribution to world thought and spirituality. They've been, in their own ways, part of the problem. They were born and shaped out of patriarchy, and in their own ways have negated the environment and women and contributed to the present crisis. But increasingly, these great religions are recognizing their crucial responsibility in activating their adherents to care for the environment in a very positive and constructive way. So we're honored today to have Dr. Bob Reese, who's a professor at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, who's taught in a range of institutions such as UCLA and UC Berkeley, who has come through Humanity Rising and offered to convene a series of sessions for us, starting today with Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism. And then in subsequent sessions, we'll be dealing with other religious traditions. We're very mindful that all these religions have a spectrum of points of view and doctrinal principles that are natural of any institutions that are, thousands of years old. But we thought this would be a place to start. So I want to welcome you, Bob, to the program. And Bob will lead us in an opening meditation. Then we'll moderate the session for the balance of our time together. Bob, thank you so much for this initiative and welcome.
Thank you, Jim. What a pleasure it is to be here. My wife and I have watched nearly every episode of Humanity Rising, and it's been such a pleasure to go to school again, as it were, and to listen to so many rich and informative and inspiring sessions. So we're looking forward today to participating in this first one of a series called The Vanishing Garden, Religion and the Fate of the Earth. Camus said, a person's life purpose is nothing more than to rediscover through the detours of art or love or passionate work those one or two images in the presence of which his or her heart first opened. In the spirit of Camus' statement, I'd like us to begin today with a brief 2-minute heart-focused meditation. All of us have had profound experiences in nature, climbing to the top of a mountain. Rick, if you can put those slides on. Climbing to the top of the mountain, holding hands with someone we love while sharing a glorious sunset on the seashore, watching a flock of birds lifting from a lake, and you can show those in quick sequence, Rick. Following the itinerant dance of butterflies or beholding the glories of the night sky. So I invite you to select and relive whatever your heart holds of some special memory in the natural world. If you're comfortable doing so, I'd like you to close your eyes, and while focusing on your heart, breathe deeply, kind of a 5-second breath in and maybe a little more slower breath out, and do that for 2 minutes. And as we do this, just want you to remember and re-experience what you once felt in the presence of some wonderful, just personal experience in nature, what you saw and heard and felt. I'll ring the ringing bowl to begin and to end our meditation. So again, if you just try and recapture, bring back into your heart that experience you had in nature. So let's begin. If you find your mind wandering, just bring it back to that experience and to your heart and your heart feeling. Remember what it felt like in your body and throughout your whole being. Now, what I want you to do, and Rick, you can stop the slideshow. What I'd like you to do is imagine what the world would be like if our children and our grandchildren and the generations after them could not have such experiences as you've just recalled. They could not remember the beauty and the sacredness directly of such an experiences. From what scientists are telling us, we are fast destroying this beautiful planet on which we live, greatly diminishing the possibility of such profound experiences and memories. So I'm grateful to Humanity Rising for providing such a marvelous kaleidoscope of sessions over the past 6 months, causing our hearts and our minds and our spirits to expand. It's been a veritable moving and immovable feast. During the 1980s, I had the privilege of taking 2 groups of distinguished American writers to China to converse with Chinese writers. One of those was the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Gary Snyder. As we traveled from Beijing to the Great Wall, Gary pointed to the eroded, barren landscape, and he said, 2,000 years ago, all this was once covered by beautiful forests as far as the eye could see. 50 years ago, Gary wrote what could serve as kind of a prelude to our discussion today. He said, like it or not, we are all inhabitory on this one small blue-green planet, the only one with comfortable temperatures, good air and water, and a wealth of living beings for millions, for quadrillions of miles, a little water hole in the vast space, a nesting place, a place of singing, a place of practice, a place of dreaming. It's clearly time, Gary said, to put hegemonial controversies aside, to turn away from economies that demand constant exploitation of both people and resources, and to put Earth first. I believe that unless we put Earth first, which is really tantamount to putting all life, including ourselves, first, there will be nothing left to put second. There's an episode in one of the scriptural traditions concerning the prophet Enoch that I find instructive in speaking about the fate of the earth. In this telling from what is known as the Book of Moses, Enoch looks into the heavens and beholds God looking upon the wickedness of his people who have rejected him and desecrated the land. And the scripture says, it came to pass that the God of heaven looked upon the residue of the people and he wept. Rick, you can put that first slide up. Enoch is astonished to see the heavens weep and shed forth their tears as the rain upon the mountains. And he asks God, how can you weep, seeing you are holy and from all eternity to all eternity? And God responds, I am weeping for these, your brothers and sisters, the workmanship of my own hands, to whom I have given knowledge and agency and this great world. I have commanded them to love one another, but behold, they are without affection. Wherefore should not the heavens weep, seeing that these shall suffer? And the record says that looking into heaven and seeing God weep, Enoch too wept. While some may consider it inexplicable, if not impossible, to believe that God could experience such sorrow as to cause weeping from the heavens, Jeremiah shows us God doing exactly that. My bowels, says God, I am pained at my very heart. My heart makes a noise in me. I cannot hold my peace, for the whole land is spoiled. The noise in God's heart is the sound of a breaking heart, reminding us of what Rabbi David Wolpe said, the whole heart, the only whole heart is a broken one. We have forgotten what it says in Leviticus. The land is mine and you are but aliens and my tenants. Throughout the country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. Slide up there. In the Midrash, it says that when God hides his face, it is to prevent his children from seeing him weep, that he's always concerned about us. It says he wraps himself round and round with his talent in order to hide in its folds and to weep. The Holy One, blessed be he, has a place and its name is secret. It is there that he sits and weeps. We can imagine God weeping over our broken world for what we have done to his magnificent gift. In the Christian tradition, Jesus weeps, including in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he is shown in deep agony of body and soul. Luke says his sweat were, as it were, great drops of blood falling to the ground. In this painting by Franz Schwarz, we see that agony. What is important in this painting, I believe, or what is among the important things, is how the angel responds to godly sorrow with great tenderness and consolation, comforting God, even like Enoch, weeping with him. In the Midrash, the rabbis changed the words in Isaiah from comfort ye, comfort ye, my people, to comfort me. God saying to us, comfort me, my people, saith your God. How can we comfort God? How can we save this planet? That is one of the great questions posed to us. Anyone who has even a superficial knowledge of the effects of climate change is aware of the mass destruction, devastation, and death our pride, our selfishness, and our indifference have set in motion. Even if we are capable of eventually saving the earth, many millions will die and much of the earth will become uninhabitable. The question of our survival is not by any means settled. So what should be our response? To begin with, we could all read Sally Bingham's book, Love God and Heal Earth. That is a great motto for us to adopt. Like almost everything, the key to saving our beautiful planet with its incredibly rich diversity, and therefore saving ourselves, is love. In his yet unpublished book, The Lens of Love, Eye of Universal Consciousness, my dear friend, Dr. Raymond Bradley argues, quote, whether as group bonds of positive attachment or as a positive emotion experienced by the individual, love generates a coherent rhythm which radiates outward as a wave field of bio-emotional energy in all directions. Therefore, one could speculate that if enough individuals and groups took seriously our collective stewardship of the earth and came together in love, collectively, we could radiate that field outwards to the present and to the future to influence every living organism on earth. In the words of the Catholic theologian Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, I love this saying, someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And then, for a second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire. What gives me hope is the power of love embedded, as Bradley asserts, in our hearts, but also in the highest teachings of the world's religions, which constitute, whose constituents represent nearly 85% of the world's population. Just think of that, 85% of the people in the world are people of faith. I believe it is fair to say that the condition of the world today represents a failure of religion, of religious and spiritual people of all persuasions who've been governed not by love and care of the earth, but rather by dominance and exploitation. But that means that the possibility for the salvation of the world also lies in the highest manifestation of religion and spirituality, the preservation of the world and humanity through love. My students at GTU, sometimes I hear them say, and I hear other people say, oh, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And I say to them, why do you have to choose? You can be both. And when is the last time that you heard of a group of spiritual people getting together to save or to feed the poor? It is spiritual and religious people who have the chance to manifest this love. Well, today we're blessed to have three remarkable spiritual leaders to share with us wisdom from their respective faith traditions. Each is a distinguished representative of his or her own faith with a commitment to redeeming the earth. Since the program notes for this session include their impressive credentials, I'll just highlight several items from each. The Reverend Canon Sally Grover Bingham is an Episcopal priest and canon of the environment in the Diocese of California. She was one of the first faith leaders to fully recognize climate change as a moral issue. Sally is the founder and president emeritus of the Regeneration Project and its Interfaith Power and Light campaign, which currently has 22,000 congregation members in 40 states. That's amazing. Sally has received a number of honors and awards for her work. Suffice it to say, she is a legend in her own time. Rabbi Fred Scherlander Daub serves as the Adat Shalom Reconstructionist Congregation in Bethesda, Maryland. As an EPA, and it's an EPA Energy Star congregation known for its many state sustainability initiatives and justice efforts, and showing as a beacon to other synagogues and congregations. A past chairperson of Interfaith Power and Light for Maryland, the District of Columbia, and Northern Virginia, Fred is now a board member of National Interfaith Power and Light. Sensei Kriti Kamko is a climate scientist, educator, activist, grief ritual leader, and Buddhist Zen priest. She is a sensei of the Renzai Zen lineage of Cold Mountain, where I visited when I was in China. A great story, by the way, when we visited Cold Mountain, Gary Snyder a number of American poets and writers, Allen Ginsberg and Toni Morrison, Maxine Hong Kingston. We came to Cold Mountain, and Gary, who had translated the Cold Mountain poems into English, when he came to the priest there, he handed him a copy of the book and said, "This book has finally come home." So that was, Cold Mountain has a special place in my heart. Kirti is also a co-founder of the Rocky Mountain Eco Dharma Retreat Center, a senior scientist in the Global Climate Program at the Environmental Defense Fund, where she helps implement climate smart farming at scale in India. So it's my pleasure now to turn time over to these panelists, starting with Sally and ending with Kriti, each of whom will take some time, and then we will have a joint conversation. And during that conversation, feel free to type in any questions into the chat section, and so we'll try to at least answer some of them. So we will now turn the time over to you, Sally, to begin this conversation on how we can respond to this vanishing garden.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. This is exciting, and it's also fun to be with Fred, who I have known for quite a long time, because he's involved with the Interfaith Power and Light program. And I just found out that Kriti, who is a scientist at Environmental Defense Fund, where I think, in fact, EDF has to take some responsibility. And now doing and did for 25 years. And I'll tell you, as I kind of begin the story, why it became important to me to have people of faith understand that we are responsible for saving creation. And it began really about almost 30 years ago when I was moving from New York to San Francisco, and our family has always been in the Episcopal Church, which reminds me, I want to remind anyone who's listening that I'm going to be speaking from my own perspective, yes, as a Christian, but I'm not speaking for the entire Christian population because it's a wide variety of folks. But I really believe, and because this movement has been so successful and grown so quickly, that all faiths have come to realize that we are the protectors of creation. But in the very beginning of my journey, I was sitting in a pew in a small Episcopal church here in San Francisco. We had just moved out from New York to San Francisco, and my child, I think my son was maybe 6 years old, was serving as an acolyte. And Sunday after Sunday, we would pray for a reverence for the earth. It's actually in the Book of Common Prayer. We would also, not every week, but every so often, would go through the 10 Commandments. And we were to love God, and we were to love our neighbors as ourselves. And I would start squirming in the pew because I thought, if we love our neighbors, we wouldn't be polluting our neighbor's air. If we love our neighbors, we wouldn't be putting engine oil in the storm drain behind our houses on the day that we wash the car. Where does it go? It goes to our neighbors. And I wasn't an environmentalist as such, but I had joined the board of Environmental Defense Fund, which is one of the largest and most successful environmental organizations, I think now, I used to say in the country, but I think now in the world, because we're working in India and Europe and China. But I was going to board meetings and learning every time I went to a board meeting about another disaster that was happening because of what humans were doing to the planet. And this just somehow was tearing me up inside. I thought, how can we say we love God, love creation, love our neighbors, and destroy this planet? And even in the 80s, Michael Oppenheimer was talking about climate change. And I thought, Jesus said, what you do to the least of us, you do to me. And the people that were suffering the most from these disasters are poor people around the world. And I just thought, I have to do something about this. I can't sit here and take in this information and not share it. And I suffered with how do we as a society come to realize that we are the caretakers? And Bob, you talked about this. We are the caretakers of this creation. And God put Adam in the garden to till it and to keep it. Right, it's right in our scripture. So I wanted to do something about it, but I had not even been to college. And it was pretty hard for me to start talking to religious leaders around the world and going to different Episcopal bishops and saying, you have to do this, without much of a background in theology. So I went to seminary with the help of the bishop here in California. And it was almost 10 years from the moment that I said, this has to change. And in 1997, I was ordained to be an Episcopal priest. It was a long journey. It's also a long story. I won't go into that, but what I found when I first started in the pulpit to talk about creation care or environmental stewardship, it was really booed. I mean, I had never heard a clergy person in any denomination, nor had any of my friends who were Buddhist and Jewish and Catholic and even Hindu, had never listened to a religious leader in their denomination talk about saving creation. I got into the pulpit at Grace Cathedral and gave my first sermon there on creation care and was booed. I mean, they didn't literally boo in the pews, but they got a lot of feedback later that I was trying to I think they said I was talking about world government or something, but it was not received very well. There were 2 or 3 people that liked the idea. And somebody actually said to me, when I said, how can you say you love God and destroy God's creation? Why are you driving that great big huge car with all those fumes coming out of the back and causing the climate to change? And I said, if you love your neighbors and if you love God, you can't behave like that. And if you call yourself Christian, you're an environmentalist. And some folks actually said, I never really thought about that before in that way. And that's sort of how this began. And I started a nonprofit in 1997, and I needed to get someone to help me with all this work, and tried to raise money and couldn't raise any money because we didn't have any specific program. And it took to 2000 for us to come up with renewable energy and climate change as becoming the probably most important environmental issue facing the world. And we knew enough, me getting my information from scientists at EDF, we knew that everything we do in life and all of life is going to be affected by the changing climate. And it's the food we eat, it's our land, our air, our water. And now we're facing, because here we are 25 years later, now we're facing environmental refugees and areas of land and water that are being destroyed to where they cannot even be repaired. I mean, we're living in a whole different world than 25 years ago. But I'm not going to leave you thinking that we can't do anything about it, because I think we can. I think there's tremendous hope on the horizon. I think enough people have been affected by climate change that it is becoming a priority for people's issues. And later on in this discussion, we might be able to talk about some of those things. But I do want to tell you, and I'm going to put it into chat, at least here in the United States, I'm going to put this in here for the panelists, that if I can find it, it's John Kerry said that Biden will be listening to God. I thought I could put it in here, but right now I can't find it. That Biden we'll trust in science to guide our work on the earth to protect God's creation. And I thought that is beautiful, and that's so hopeful for the time that we're entering into now, where we hope to have a lot of healing on a lot of subjects here in America. And I'm going to stop now and let, I guess, Fred, are you going next? And you can do your spiel, and then we'll all come together and have a conversation.
Fantastic. And let the people say amen to Reverend Sally's teachings. And what beautiful bookends, because we have an EDF scientist who will be batting cleanup, as it were. Honored to be part of this, and so many important voices being lifted up in the chat as well. What a rich conversation. I wanted to very quickly try to cover the waterfront for anyone who has not gone deeper in exactly the sort of conversion, if you will, that Sally just spoke to, of understanding that religion, in particular, the Western scriptural tradition, though this applies, of course, globally and perhaps beyond, the ways in which this is sort of inherently environmental. So in not much more than 8 minutes, I'm going to try to cover 8 points with a ton of visuals as to reasons and ways that we might actually prioritize this as the central issue. So number one, it's already been said, and Bob and Jim both pointed to this in the opening, that this is timely and urgent. There's a classic midrash over 1,000 years ago that after God created this garden, this program is called the Vanishing Garden, that God led the first Adam, who, by the way, should not be referred to as man, and neither should God be referred to as he, because male and female were created in the image of God. Work that one backwards. So the androgynous God led the androgynous first human around all the trees of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, and said, look, it's awesome, it's yours, but be mindful. Do not destroy and spoil my world. If you destroy it, there's no one after you to rebuild it. That's not modern radical environmentalism. That's just our tradition. And it relies on data. There is no conflict between enlightened religion and science. In fact, quite the opposite. They are equally necessary. We all know the ice core samples. We just need to understand the data that for over 1 million years, new data goes back to probably 3 million years, that atmospheric concentration of CO2 was never above 300 parts per million. And we are already pushing it into the low 400s, and it's rising 3 a year. Those numbers sound small. They are staggering by scientific logic. And God gave us intellect and gave us research so that we could understand, we could look at trends like this, we could extrapolate the future. COVID curves apply similarly, and do the right thing in time to make a difference. So there is no planet B, as people love to say. It is timely, it is urgent, and we channel what comes out of the civil rights tradition and elsewhere, as Dr. King wrote from the Birmingham jail, the fierce urgency of now when it comes to this greatest issue of justice and even survival. Second point, you heard this in the introduction from Bob. Theologically, whose earth is it? And this is the quote from Leviticus 25, introducing the sabbatical and Jubilee years. The land is mine, ki li haaretz, says God. You are just dwellers. None of us are full owners of any of this. And we need to remember that. The core sort of personal practice here is anava, humility, taking up the right amount of space. There's this beautiful tradition in Kabbalah, Jewish mystical tradition, that tries to answer, how was there room for creation in a world where there was nothing but God? God was everywhere. The answer is God self-contracted out of love, was willing to make God's self smaller and create space where God wasn't in the name of relationship. We need to do the same, especially we who are disproportionately contributing to the climate crisis because of our travel, because of our diet, because of our consumption, because of our 401k plans and investments in fossil fuels, etc. The ones who have done the most to drive this crisis need to be the ones to own up with the greatest humility. Psalm 24, the core of what is called liberation theology, del Señor es la tierra, l'Adonai haaretz umloa. The earth is God's and the fullness thereof. 3, the idea of conservation. 613 Jewish laws, number 529 is don't waste, but others call it the first and most general call of God that comes to you when you understand that you have this unique role within the ecosystem. And so what originally is about not destroying trees in wartime becomes don't even misuse oil. That's in the Talmud 1600 years ago. Righteous people do not waste in this world even a mustard seed. And that, of course, symbolic in the ancient world for the smallest thing they could understand. They didn't have atomic physics yet. They didn't know quarks and neutrinos, but that's a parable for the kingdom of God, of course, in the New Testament as well. Number 4, justice, social justice, racial justice, interpersonal is part of the climate challenge and also necessary for its solution. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. It's doubled in Deuteronomy 16. That's how important it is. And it's not just practice justice in your own backyard. It's whenever you come across the blood of your neighbor, you must not stand idly by. Leviticus 19, alongside love your neighbor as yourself. What does that look like in this interconnected world of almost 8 billion people to not stand idly by the blood of our neighbor? Blood is being shed already by the growing impacts of climate change, and we ain't seen nothing yet. So many places are disproportionately impacted. We need to remember we are all vulnerable. And we also need to remember that some are more vulnerable than others. And this is that crazy dance of mitigation. We all need to work hard to cut our carbon and create policies that do so society-wide. And then adaptation, we need to help those who are already suffering the ill effects to be more resilient and better able for their own survival. And that is disproportionately the global South. And finally, suffering is all that's left if we don't mitigate or help with adaptation. This is the sacred work in front of us. This is religious work. That's why so many religions have some version of this notion, love thy neighbor. Now, the idea here of justice and interconnection speaks also to the need to have Buddhists and Jews and Muslims and Christians and Hindus and others all in dialogue together. And much more to say about that, but not right now. As Rabbi Joachim Prinz said right before Dr. King in 1963 on the National Mall, neighbor is not a geographic concept, it is a moral concept. And he said that long before the internet. We are all neighbors in a global village. Love your neighbor as yourself has direct climate impact. We cannot get there without understanding structural racism. We cannot get there without naming the demons of our past and acknowledging them and privileging the voices of frontline communities. Thus, Black Lives Matter is very much part of the climate conversation. Love thy neighbor, as our friends from the Quaker tradition says, no exceptions. 4 more super quickly. Save a life is a top priority in religion. This is the logic behind wearing masks in COVID. It is the logic behind simply rethinking how we do what we do in light of the climate crisis. Number 6, humans are not alone. We are one species among millions, and it's the interconnected whole at Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 31 that is very good. Humanity alone, the Bible doesn't even say is good. Interconnected whole is very good. That's us as just one little piece of a magnificent creation, all of which has its own right to be here. The Noah story near the beginning of that Western scriptural tradition. What was Noah but the first endangered species activist? And that is a great place for us to begin our efforts. It's also part of humility. Let our one species take up less space. So many religious leaders have said this, Pope Francis most notably, and His, of course, 5 years ago, Laudato Si said so much about this, but just recently, Fratelli Tutti, reminding us that in the post-COVID world, we need to rethink everything as well. We have an opportunity in the midst of this global tragedy, and we must not waste it. Back to interfaith, the idea that people from different traditions that used to be in a subjugation model instead are now side by side learning from each other's traditions. We must appreciate the diversity and the intricacy and the beauty around us. Home stretch, number 7, Deuteronomy 22, simple. When you put up a house, you put a parapet around the roof. You don't say only if it's 20 degrees or less where people are likely to congregate. You don't wait for industry-funded studies to cloud it and say, well, we have to have at least 4 children who have fallen off a roof before we enact legislation. No, you put up something potentially dangerous. You put a parapet around it. You take the extra time, expense, and thought to bring precaution in from the beginning. We are conducting an unprecedented, but most importantly, uncontrolled, there is no control group, experiment with the global climate. That is not biblical. That is not religious. That is not ethical. That is not sustainable. We don't know when too late is for individual people, ecosystems, societies, species. It's already too late. For many of us, we think it's still too soon, but we're somewhere in the middle. We don't want to push it. We do this for the sake of social justice, the poor and disempowered. We do this for creation's own sake. And finally, we do it for our descendants. Choose life that you and your children may live. So much of our society is driven in quarterly earnings reports or biennial, quadrennial political cycles, when in fact what we need is multi-generational thought. We hear that from our youth, Greta Thunberg most notably, and I end with Le Dor Vador, from generation to generation. As Exodus reminds us, the divine thought extends to the 3rd and 4th and 1000th generation, much like Iroquois and other Native American traditions, reminding us to consider the implications of our actions even unto the 7th generation. If we do that, we will make a difference. Thank you all. Kriti, please.
Wow, this is so beautiful to hear Sally and Fred, you go before me and lift up science and lift up what sometimes as a person of color speaking, I end up speaking about intersectionality between, uh, you know, white supremacy, racism, and climate crisis. So thank you, Fred. Thank you, Sally, for lifting up EDF. I have a few slides, but somewhat in response to what Fred shared so passionately, I wanted to bring up a few numbers and then I'll move to my slides that talk about Buddhism. I ask everyone to do a calculation in their mind. What is an average American's carbon footprint? Which means every year, how many pounds of carbon dioxide you might be responsible for because of the way we cook, eat, drive, the food we eat, all the greenhouse gases it produces. Maybe there can be some answers in the chat. I'll give it a few seconds so I don't spend too much time. Any guesses here? I'm not seeing numbers come up, so I'll give you the answer because I want to set up a very crucial contrast. An average American today produces 65,000 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalents every year. For us to have climate sanity, right? I'm wearing my climate scientist hat right now. This must decrease to 5,000 pounds, from 65,000 to about 5,000 pounds a year of carbon dioxide. Now that's a huge thing, and that's all of this responsibility, driving less, eating plant-based food is included. what I want to set contrast of, and that's where I want to bring in Buddhism, is the planet. What the planet sees is not 65,000 pounds, my dears. Planet sees 135 trillion pounds of carbon dioxide every year. A trillion number is just massive. What I'm saying and what has already been referred to is that we need a system-wide response to the calamity. And our religious traditions, Buddhism included, are just beginning to grapple with how much we want to resist the greed and delusion, right? Systems level. And why are we not able to resist the systems? Why are we not able to do what we keep saying? EDF, my home organization, keeps saying solutions are right here. Okay. There is always a response that the corporate greed is coming in the way. Of course, yes, it's there. But why are we people not getting organized? So this is where I want to share my screen and talk about. This is just my intro slides. In Buddhism, the fundamental teaching is that the state of reality is like what we call an Indra's net. And I'm going to explain this. It's like, imagine a multi-dimensional spider's web in early morning covered with dewdrops. Every dewdrop contains reflection of all the other dewdrops. Each reflected dewdrop and the reflections of all the other dewdrops are in each reflection ad infinitum. This is Buddhist conception of universe in an image. What it's essentially saying is, Thich Nhat Hanh, the very famous Zen Buddhist, had this phrase called interbeing. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that. Interbeing means I am not just connected to Fred or I'm connected to Sally or Bob. I am Bob, Fred, and Sally. We are interbeing. And Indra's net is also talking about same reality. Each unit of consciousness, each unit of life is fundamentally one. So to go back to what I was referring to is the problem. Why we are not able to respond is that our sense of connection with each other is broken. And now it has become a chicken and egg problem. We don't feel connected to each other, and trauma is further accelerating how separated we feel. What do I mean by that? In North America, 1 in 3 people have witnessed domestic violence as a kid. 1 in 4 have alcoholic relatives. 1 in 4 have been beaten to the point they have marks on their bodies. And 1 in 5 were sexually molested as a child. You'd see, what does this have to do with climate? This trauma comes in the way of us forming powerful communities. What we know to be spiritually right, morally right, scientifically right, we have the solutions in front of us, but we are not able to act. We cannot see our connections with each other, and the trauma makes us unable to relate to each other in ways where we can trust each other and stand up as a community. I have written extensively about it, so I will not go on. And I have not even named the impact of racial trauma, gender-based trauma, class, or climate trauma here. My thesis is trauma and shame bring us to fight, flight, and freeze mind, which leads to lack of deep relationships, which leads to lack of climate action. No matter what the corporations are doing, why are we frozen, right? And to borrow from Fred, he was talking about regenerative action. I have been promoting for a long time that we need regenerative relationships. How do we relate to it in each other that in each interaction I am replenished? I feel I can be vulnerable and authentic with you. You trust me, I trust you, and I will have your back when you march on the streets and you speak up on behalf of all of humanity, all species, and the planet. Okay. So fundamentally, Buddhist teaching of interconnectedness, that we are, interbeing we are. People are not able to see it. We can talk about it intellectually, right? The challenge is how do we experience that connection? And what I am saying is that we need to address deep, wide trauma. I'll stop here and I hope it made some sense. Handing it back to you, Bob.
Well, let me say how deeply touched and impressed and inspired I am by these three gifted human beings who have brought perspectives from their respective traditions here. And a part of it for me, one of the things I love about teaching at a theological university, like a Graduate Theological Union, is that I learn so much from my students. It is a pleasure to teach them, but it's a greater pleasure to learn from them. And I feel I have learned from all three of you today. What I'd like to do is to open this up now for a discussion amongst the three of you, and I'll kind of listen in and maybe say something here. And I think whoever's putting this together, Rick, can you put the four of us kind of in a conversation mode here?
Yep, you're in all of you are up.
Okay, great. So I would first of all just invite you to, if any of you wishes to respond to something the other said, and let that kind of be a way to germinate a conversation. Obviously, it would be nice to have 10 hours to do this rather than 15 or 20 minutes, but we take what we have. So I turn it over to Sally and Fred and Katri to just converse amongst yourselves about the things that you have introduced into the conversation.
Well, I'll just make one comment. Am I muted? No.
No.
Every one of you that has spoken has used the word regenerative. And I didn't tell you when I started the nonprofit that the title was the Regeneration Project. And that was in 1997. And then the Interfaith Power and Light grew out of that. And that's the campaign that we focus on. But the Regeneration Project, because it was a regeneration of spirit, of land, of air. It was a regeneration of everything we could think of. We had to regenerate ourselves and our environment. And that word now is being used a tremendous amount in the language about how we're going to rethink the way we look after this planet. And I just feel that I'm on my way out of this movement in that I have recently retired. And I think there are so many wonderful young people who are coming along that are going to take over this movement. I think the faith community can be a hugely have a great big influence on how we, Bob, you said, I think that 85% of the people have some religious faith.
Yes.
And if we had all those religious leaders talking about this issue to their constituents, I mean, think of the difference it would make. And I think that's beginning to happen. We've got 22,000 congregations in America that are involved in the Interfaith Power and Light program, and it represents some 8 million people who are going into a congregation on a regular basis and having somebody talk to them about the climate problem and all of these specific issues about whether we use electric cars or fossil fuel cars or, however we get our energy has to all be rethought, regenerated. And I just feel that's beginning to happen. I mean, we have these laws coming up in California now where you're not going to be allowed to buy a car that's made with needs gas to run, and that's happening all over the country. And I think that even China, and I think that Kriti, you probably know what's happening in China, because I know we have a Environmental Defense Fund has a whole chapter there, and they're doing a lot of work with China. And where people think China is destroying the world, it's actually doing more with wind and solar than we are in America. And I don't know if you want to comment on what's going on in China.
Sure, Sally. And China has already built out. I work for our India program. India still has 70% population in villages. We are working in China to ramp up renewable energy and wind farms by putting a price on carbon. And I'm not sure people in this conversation want to hear talk too much about it. I want to set up a contrast with India and then bring it back to the spiritual religious conversation. In India, 70% of India is still not built. They still need buildings. They still don't have electricity, ways to cook. In India, we are trying to keep people from relying on fossil fuel energy. That's the huge challenge there. The religious and spiritual challenge in all of this is, how do we, there is racism and then there is internalized racism, which I think is a spiritual problem. How do we have a lot of Asia and Africa not want to be where America is? It's not just that we want them to bypass use of fossil fuel energy. We have internalized as people in India and Africa, that we need that level of living where you have X number of cars and that big a house, which is not sustainable. So I'm coming back to this problem of how much damage internalized white supremacy or internalized racism does to our psyche, that we feel like we always need more materials more than how precious it is to connect with you, Sally, and to you, Fred, to Bob, to come back to that interconnection, right? To experience that Indra's net, so to speak. And I feel like we have congregations. I've seen this shift within Buddhist congregation, Buddhist communities, temples. We are talking about climate. In my view, we still aren't talking about systematic systems change as much as we could. We are still taking steps towards individual action, not questioning the systems deeply enough, more radically enough. That's just my personal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't wait for us to get there. And I think addressing trauma and continuing to look at systems are two challenges as spiritual religious communities. Because one last thought from me, we have amazing psychotherapists. I have benefited from them, but the extent and depth of trauma we have, one-on-one psychotherapy or even counseling with our clergy is not going to solve it. We need more community healing approaches.
Fred, can you
Yeah.
jump in
So
here?
so building on that beautiful insight from Kuti, remember that the youth-led climate movement, Sunrise and others, the motto along with 350.org and other groups is to change everything, we need everyone. And that connects so many of these pieces. We need everyone, we can finish that sentence, we need everyone to understand that we are a dewdrop somewhere on Indra's net. Right? We also need everyone to stop and question what is my contribution to the global climate crisis, whether it's through my vote or my inaction, or whether it's through my diet and my consumption habits and my investments. But the beginning of that is to change everything. And that's an assumption that many of us already understand and have internalized. We need to change everything. Not everyone is there. But exactly as Sally said, right, picking up on this 85% idea, we already have a majority in this country of people who are affiliated with, and in the world, people affiliated with institutions and religious bodies who say that there is a climate crisis. And if we could simply reduce that gap, right? We all live with cognitive dissonance between our awareness of how huge the problem is and where our personal actions are because of habits and personal wishes and comfort zones and selfishness and all of that, right? We live in that gap, but wherever there is that kind of cognitive dissonance, there's the hope that there's something amiss until we reconcile and shrink that gap. And that is where I take the greatest hope. And that is why it's so important to bring these multi-religious conversations together.
I'm very interested, Sally, in if you have thought, and the others of you have thought about that word regeneration in terms of generation and the generations that are coming after us. And I think the concern, going back to Sally, what you said about the least of these, and Fred, you said something clearly that echoes that from your own tradition of Judaism. These children and grandchildren that are, and their cohort are our most precious treasure. How do we regenerate, taking the things you said, in so that that generation carries this initiative after we're gone?
Yeah. Well, I think we have a big responsibility. I mean, our generation has not done a very good job with protecting anything that helps us to survive. Right? We're not taking care of our own health. So I think we have a responsibility, if we have children and grandchildren, to be sure that we, in some way, I don't want to say that we educate them, but in a way, that is the word, that we take them out into nature. You started this whole program with where have you been that you felt comfort in nature. And often, I mean, there are so many people now who really find God in nature and not in a brick building. And I think if we can take our children and grandchildren and their friends and whatever we can do to bring the next generation along to understand nature the way we all did. When I first started doing this and talking to people, we would say, what has been your experience with God? Or where have you felt the most divinely connected to anything? And without fail, people say, in nature. I find it in nature. And so I think that it's very important for us to be sure that inner city children get out to the mountains and that we can somehow regenerate the idea that we need to, if we don't take care of the earth, we're not taking care of ourselves. To understand that what you eat and what you drink and what you breathe is who you are. And I think it's a big responsibility, but I think we can do it. If we all understand that this is what needs to happen, I think we can do it. And religious leaders will play a big role in making this happen. And I think Kriti, isn't one of the Buddhist mandates that that thing about the butterfly that flutters way thousands of miles away, you feel in another place, that everything is connected. If you harm some piece of anything, you're harming the whole thing. And that's kind of a wonderful, I think, philosophy that the Buddhists have.
Exactly. I mean, that's the Indra's net. If you touch one dewdrop in that net, everything is affected. And I often like to say, you know, the crisis that we are facing, it's like with my right hand, I have to stop my left hand from hurting my left leg.
Ah,
It's one body. I don't have to demonize anyone, but I do have to stop the damage. We do have to rise up to, there is butterfly effect, but that doesn't mean I don't stop my own body from harming itself. Yeah. And this thing about nature, Sally, that you said, that's exactly the reason we founded this Eco Dharma Retreat Center. We've gotten, even in Buddhism, where meditation is the basis of everything, right? Realizing, experiencing Indra's net. We'd gotten used to doing it indoors, and we are saying bring the meditation back into natural settings. So it's crucial that we combine prayer and meditation somehow as religious leaders, faith leaders, and bring it back to
nice.
natural ecosystems so we can learn from ecosystems, you know.
Mhm. I also want to add, and thank you so much, that for another angle on regeneration, picking up that earlier thread, this is regeneration of religion. This is revalidating the very ground and relevance of these ancient traditions, most of which were initially indigenous teachings, right? It's hard to understand the Torah without understanding the growing cycles of the Levant. Right? It's hard to understand Hinduism or Buddhism without understanding South Asian climate and reality, or Islam and the Arabian Peninsula. And so we were all once place-based, and now we are so far away. We become more authentic versions of our ancient selves when we tap into the natural wisdom of each of our traditions. We also, and this is a selling point for the more insular or conservative-minded within our own traditions, and we all have them, right? That this is authentic scriptural dharma. You know, it's in there, but it's also a way of ensuring that this message goes forward, and that the young people who get in their bones what a survival issue it is for their generation, what our generations have lain upon them, and the diminishing futures as climate crisis grows, which of course it will, because carbon stays for 100 years, methane for 20 plus. So it's only going to get worse before it gets better. And yet, in addressing it, there is hope for religion to enter the 21st century in a meaningful and appropriate and powerful way.
And I think this is especially true considering the growing secularism in the world for people who no longer see the treasure and the beauty and the wisdom in these faith traditions that you've all exemplified in your remarks today. I'm looking forward to, I have this wish that we could simply extend this conversation for a very long time, because I feel wanting more of the things that you've said and the images that you've had. We're going to have to turn this back to Jim in a few minutes, but first of all, I love, as a poet and as somebody who teaches literature as well as religion, I'm very interested in metaphors, and I appreciate the metaphors that you've introduced into the conversation. And was thinking of one that might be appropriate for this discussion. And what came to me was the Pando forest, forest grove in Utah's Fish Lake region, and Rick, you can put up some slides as we do this. This grove, known as Trembling Giant, consists of a single clonal root system for thousands of individual trees, something like Kriti's metaphor. It is considered the largest and oldest living organism on Earth. It's 80,000 years old. Imagine that. Its intertwined root system consists of nearly 50,000 stems that cover 100 acres and weigh 6,000 tons. As inhabitants of the Earth, we could be likened to Panda's intertwined root system. Like the individual aspen trees, humans live and die, but like the forest itself, humanity has continued to survive. Therefore, while each stem has a comparatively short lifespan, the entire clone can live for tens of thousands of years. When we were meditating earlier, I asked you to think of some experience in nature. What I meditated on was standing in the midst of this forest in Utah and beholding the beauty of those trees, looking at each individual tree in early fall and realizing that each of those trees was connected to all of the other trees, listening to the wind through the leaves, that beautiful music, that entire web of trees and their intertwined roots were producing. And I felt like I was standing on holy ground because I really feel that I was. And standing there, I felt a compulsion to do what I could do to save that beautiful grove of trees. This beautiful and enduring and yet ultimately vulnerable botanical treasure stands as a metaphor for where we are now in terms of our care of the earth. Owen Staples writes, I believe we can learn from Pando with our own roots planted firmly and extending deeply into the earth. Over time, our thirst for nourishment, our thirst for living water and knowledge can preserve us and help us to survive droughts, forest fires, floods, and the like. And it's interesting, standing there, I had just come from the great conference on the environment at Claremont. And I remember someone saying to me as we left the conference, and I said I was going to the Panda Forest, they said, you know, for the first time in its 80,000 year history, because of climate change, we can see it's beginning to die. And it just touched me so deeply. And as I stood there looking at that, deeply touched by the image of that, we've been blessed by the wisdom and spiritual guidance today from these three great traditions. And I want to express gratitude to them on behalf of all of you. I want to conclude by saying, Dr. Bradley once asked me, as he and I were talking about something, he said, the most important question you can ask in any situation, Bob, is what is the most loving thing I can do? And as I thought about this in this conversation, what is the most loving thing we can do for God, for ourselves, for one another, for all living creatures, for the earth itself? In the coming days and weeks and months, let us ask, what is the most loving thing I can do today, tomorrow, and afterwards? And then seek to find the answer as we manifest the most loving thing we can do. Thank you all again so much. And Jim, we'll turn the time back over to you.
Oh boy, Bob, that was a powerful ending, to think that an 80,000-year-old organism that has endured climate change, ice ages, turbulence probably that we can't even imagine, and lived on, is now under the impact of the Anthropocene starting to die. mean, that just made me kind of choke up. And we all need to think about this, guys. We need to take it in what we're doing here. We just need to take it in. And what came up for me, Fred, was your comment in your PowerPoint. What is humility? It's right sizing. Humanity's gotten way out of size. And part, I think, of what the pandemic is doing to humanity is knocking us down back toward the true size. And so I want to just appreciate this definition of humility. It may be the most important virtue of our time. If you can love, but if you love without right sizing, it can actually contribute to the problem. And so I just thought that was, in light of Pando, this whole notion of humility, and this notion that Noah was the first endangered species activist. I hadn't actually thought about that, but you're right. You're right. And, we've been here before. We've been here before. And the power of the story of Noah is someone who, in the face of catastrophe, figured a way through. And you're calling the Regenerative Action Network and so forth, Sally. Noah was one of the first regenerators. He built an ark. He thought out of the box, boy, right. And made it through whatever it was that came down. That was an awesome deluge that was visited upon humankind. And your notions, Kriti, of regenerative relationships. And, I started the program around a master's in regenerative action. And Sally, Kriti, I would love to be in touch with you. I'd love to have a course on regenerative relationships. That would be beautiful. Because, if the point of the exercise is not just to disseminate knowledge, the world is awash with knowledge, but to empower action. How do we develop humility? How do we develop regenerative relationships at all levels? This is the challenge of the hour. So I want to appreciate it. And I think I would conclude my remarks with the point that you made, Kriti, around that the big major religions are just beginning this process. They forgot for centuries why they were actually here and contributed to the building of a civilization that has brought us to the present crisis. And part of all of our religious reflection needs to start with the trauma that the major religions have contributed to. And then, as Fred, you did so skillfully, go back to the compendium of tradition and pull out what was there all the time. All the time. And I want to emphasize this in conclusion by saying, think for a moment. Do you think IBM is going to be here in 500 years? I doubt it. Do you think the United States or France or Germany will be here in 500 years? I doubt it. Will Judaism, will Christianity, will Buddhism, will Hinduism, will Taoism be here in 500 years? Absolutely. These traditions are the most powerful institutions humanity has ever known. They will endure. And if at this critical moment, the great religions speak truth to power, which was what they were conceived to do. Think Moses. You talk about speaking truth to power. Think Jesus. Talk about speaking truth to power. Think Buddha. Talk about speaking truth to power. My God. And at this time, knowing what we're doing to the Pando forest, we are called to be religious in a way that we've never imagined was possible. Because what we've heard today, everyone, is the essence of true religion in the 21st century, as we go into the most critical decade in the history of our kind. So, Bob, I really want to thank you for this panel. I mean, this has been profound. It's been moving. It's been inspiring, and I'm deeply grateful. So, Fred, Sally, Kriti, Bob, we salute you. And we invite you and all of you who have the time to join our after session chat, where we can go into more depth. And then just to say a word about Monday. On Monday, we're going to be taking up one word: adaptation, adaptivity, which, like regeneration, is one of those words that's been in the language for a very long time, but basically on the margins, without practical or philosophical or political importance. And now, just like with regeneration, adaptation is emerging as a critically important concept. We're going to spend Monday thinking about what it means to adapt to a world in which there is no more normal. Because as Fred said right at the beginning, we ain't saying nothing yet, ladies and gentlemen. We're now in a cascade, a crescendo of crises. So regenerativity, adaptivity are now the watchwords we need to deeply understand, because it could determine our very survival and our capacity to develop the kind of radical collaboration that can turn this thing around and ensure a world that's worthy of our children under the 7th generation. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much again, Bob. We look forward to your next session, and have a good weekend. And we'll see everyone again on Monday for the next session of Humanity Rising. And you can get the link to the chat in the chat box.
I've sent it to all of the panelists, Jim.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay, everyone, be well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Contemplate the Pando forest. Let that possibility just be in your heart. Hold it in your heart, and a deep wisdom will emerge.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.